Well, good afternoon and welcome to this very special Parent Kind webinar with Professor Becky Francis. I'm Frank Young. I'm Director of Policy and Research at Parent Kind, and I'm your host for this afternoon's webinar. I have a very simple job this afternoon, which is to say as little as possible so that Becky Francis can speak to us. We're really pleased to be able to welcome Professor Becky Francis to this webinar today. Becky is leading the independent review into the school curriculum and the way we assess it. Her work and that of a panel supporting her will have a big impact on our children in the years to come, and is arguably one of the most significant things that the new UK government is undertaking at the moment. We're delighted that Becky Francis has agreed to join this parent webinar, jointly hosted with the Curriculum and Assessment Review, to demonstrate really how important parents are to the work of the review. Becky is going to present a few slides this afternoon on the work she is doing and the role of the Curriculum and Assessment Review to inform us all on this call before we take questions that have been submitted by real-life parents, of which I'm one, that Becky will do her best to answer. Before we pass over to Becky Francis, I will briefly introduce Becky, who is education royalty. Professor Becky Francis has a long history in academia, in education and social justice, and since 2020 has been Chief Executive of the Education Endowment Foundation, an organisation, if you don't know it, that conducts highly significant research on what works in education. I've known Becky for a number of years, and I know she is passionate about evidence, and I think you can expect her to reference evidence extensively this afternoon. She is also deeply passionate about social justice and helping children from disadvantaged and poorer backgrounds to succeed. I will hand over to Becky now to give a very short presentation to explain the work that she and her panel are doing before we jump into questions from parents. Becky, over to you.
Thanks so much, Frank, and thanks so much for the opportunity to speak with everybody today. I'm going to do a brief introduction now to explain the background to the review before, as Frank says, we turn to question and answer. So many of you will be familiar, I think, that back in the summer, following the general election, the government announced the formation of an independently led curriculum and assessment review to undertake a review of the current national curriculum and the statutory assessment system in England. And the review is very ambitious. We're tasked in the space of, just over a year to do a refresh of the curriculum and assessment arrangements right across from Key Stage 1 right through into post-16. We're focused on the challenges to attainment for young people and any barriers or blocks that hold young people back from the opportunities and life chances that they deserve. And we're taking a social justice lens to the review. So we're particularly focused on young people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged or that have special educational needs and disabilities. And in terms of this webinar today, the views of you as parents, but also other stakeholders across the system, obviously young people, but also professionals such as teachers, college lecturers, education experts, and so forth, and employers. We're seeking input from all of those stakeholder groups to the review, because the national curriculum belongs to us all. It's our society's way of investing in the precious knowledge and skills which we pass down, but also put our interests in, being taught to our young people for the next generation. So to that end, we all have a stake in the curriculums, I think. And we as a review group want to hear about the strengths and weaknesses of the current system and ways in which it can be improved. So we've been doing a whole raft of evidence gathering. Back towards the end of September, we launched a call for evidence, and that extended for 2 months. We've also been traveling across the country, meeting teachers, young people, parents, and other experts at our roadshow events in different regions across the country. And we've been doing webinars like this one, and holding oral evidence roundtables and so on as well. In terms of timelines, we're going to be publishing our interim report in spring 2025, which will really be a problem diagnosis. And then the final report will be launched in early autumn 2025. Next slide, please. This introduces you to our review panel. So I'm lucky to be supported by a range of experts who we've appointed to really represent expertise across the different sectors that the review covers. So primary, secondary, and post-16. And there is also specific expertise represented in terms of assessment and also curriculum theory. We're, as I said, drawing in, of course, other important stakeholder views in ways like this webinar, but really targeting demographics and representatives not represented on the panel, including, of course, young people whose views we're taking very seriously through roundtables, focus groups, polling, and so on. If I could have the next slide, please. In terms of our purpose, this is the overarching purpose: to consider the broad ambition for what every young person should be expected to achieve by age 18, and review the existing curriculum and assessment mechanisms to determine the best means of achieving this. And there are a range of different facets that sit behind this. We're starting with what we want all young people to know and achieve by Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5. And then we're working backwards through the curriculum to ensure that we've removed barriers and refreshed the curriculum to ensure efficacy in supporting those outcomes. In terms of goals, we want to provide a strong foundation in core subjects, a broad and balanced curriculum that includes arts and vocational subjects, and to ensure that young people are ready for life and work. We are looking at assessment as well, as I've said. We're focused on capturing the strengths of every student within a balanced assessment system, and the current performance measures, which you know are often very influential in schools' behaviour. These also fall within our purview. I've said we're taking a social justice lens, so of course that means a particular focus on equity and inclusion, with special attention to removing blocks to progress for socioeconomically disadvantaged and otherwise vulnerable young people, to try to secure positive outcomes and progress for everybody. And then the final bullet on the screen in front of you is an important one in terms of what's not in scope. I've said that the review is a short one, with a space of only just over a year in total. But it's also focused primarily on the national curriculum. So to that end, the early years foundation stage is outside our scope. And also there are a range of other things that fall outside our scope, including extracurricular activities like careers advice and work experience, enrichment activities, and so on. And some of you will also already be thinking about the challenge then for the review, because of course, those areas are often very complementary and intertwined with the national curriculum. And also outside our scope are some other really profound areas that interlock tightly with the curriculum, such as pedagogy, so teaching methods and styles and so forth. Also resource, which as many of you know is very stretched in schools at the moment. And of course, linked to that, workforce supply issues. You'll be aware that there's a teacher recruitment and retention crisis. It's very difficult to teach subjects in secondary schools well without subject expert teachers and so on. So these are challenges for the review, but challenges that we must try to navigate because of our terms of reference focus on curriculum and assessment. Next slide, thank you. We have a series of principles of the review. If you want to look at these more broadly, because there's a longer list, you can see them appended in our terms of reference. But they are very dear to me, authored by me, and they've set us some really helpful parameters so far, especially given the tight timeline. So first of all, as Frank was hinting, it will be no surprise that a priority is to be evidence and data informed. We want to be basing changes that we make on solid evidence rather than being distracted by myths or kind of untested assumptions that tend to circulate within education. We are committed to evolution, not revolution. I know that this has been frustrating to some who would like to see a sort of root and branch change to our education system, but there are two main reasons for this approach. One is that actually our system remains very successful in many ways, including internationally. You can see this in terms of comparison with other countries. And so there are many things that actually teachers and young people have worked hard to achieve in our system over the last 20 years. And we want to ensure that we build on those and retain them rather than accidentally doing harm. The second element is the lack of capacity in the system at present, which I've already hinted at. I've talked about workforce supply issues. I've talked about resource issues. These issues mean that there is very little either wherewithal or appetite in the profession at the moment for whole-scale change. So again, this explains the evolution, not revolution approach, and this has been broadly welcomed, I think. Linked to this, we're very aware of trade-offs. We're aware of issues around implementation, how things land on the ground, and also the risk of unintended consequences, including extra workload for hard-pressed staff. So to this end, we're very focused on key issues and really trying to hone in where there are problems in the system at the moment without destabilizing the system more widely. We're committed to a high quality curriculum for all and very much maintaining the long-standing approach in England of a comprehensive system to age 16. This makes us a relative international outlier alongside the Scandinavian nations and Canada, but it's one that really does aid securing social mobility and equity for all as found by the OECD. So that's something that we'll be maintaining. We're also committed to removing barriers to success, ensuring access to quality education and pathways for all young people. And we've been committed to a consultative approach, which I hope that we're modelling today. We've been engaging, as I've said, with a wide range of stakeholders across the country and obviously have our widespread call for evidence as well. Next slide. And just quickly to finish in terms of our next steps, I've said we've been doing a whole range of evidence gathering and we're now at the stage of digesting that evidence. we will be, as you see, we've got over 7,000 responses, so that's quite a lot to digest. The interim report I've mentioned is due to be published in spring, and we'll then be getting into the kind of harder, more targeted work of subject level and kind of sector level distillation, looking at key issues that have been identified in our evidence taking. So thanks very much. I think that's probably my introduction finished. I'll be glad to answer any questions about that, as well as your broader questions when we come to the Q&A, and I'm back in your hands, Frank.
Thank you very much for that overview of the curriculum and assessment review. I'm very conscious, as I suspect everyone on this call is, of the huge impact that the curriculum and assessment review will likely have on the education that our children as parents experience. And I wondered whether you could perhaps just explain to us as parents what sort of difference you think we will see in our education system and the education that our children receive as a consequence of your review.
Thanks, Frank. Well, those questions are really hard to answer, and maybe I'll have to do a little bit of managing expectations here for participants as well, because frustratingly for you, I think, there's very little I can say at present in terms of our actual findings and direction. That's because we've only just, closed the call for evidence. We're building our interim report, of course, but really we'll be able to say very little until we've been able to distill that evidence and really consider the implications. But probably what I can say at sort of high level is that I think there's no doubt it's time for a refresh. It's been over a decade since the last review of the national curriculum. So of course, some things have, changed over time, become dated and so forth. And there are various concerns and questions raised about the breadth and depth of the present curriculum offer. We're committed in our terms of reference to ensuring both breadth and appropriate depth, including access to, for example, arts and vocational subjects. Now, it's very interesting to me that, again, when we think about evidence, there's a very widespread discourse that the arts have been deprioritized and fallen away in the last decade, since the last curriculum review. Actually, when we look at the data, we can see that the picture's rather more nuanced than that. Art as a subject remains very strong in terms of uptake. And actually very little has changed at Key Stage 3, so that's age 11 to age 14. But at Key Stage 4, the GCSE years, we can see that there has been some falling away for particular elements of the arts, notably including drama and dance. And design technology has also fallen dramatically over the last 10 years. So the picture's sort of relatively nuanced, if you see what I mean. But nevertheless, we can see these different trends over time. Some of this explanation is to do with the fact that we can see an increase in teaching hours for maths and English, and of course literacy and numeracy in primary schools. That was incentivized by various performance measures and government encouragement and so forth. And the question is it actually a good thing that we're spending more attention to maths and English, or actually is the fact that it's slightly squeezed other subjects a problem in the system? So these are the kind of questions that we'll be trying to draw on the evidence and then adjudicate. And that one of the challenges, Frank, is that I would say that there probably is no perfect answer to any of these dilemmas. They are dilemmas and a series of trade-offs, as I've said, but we will be trying to take an evidence-led approach to guide us through.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I look forward to having this conversation again in another 10 years, perhaps, when we do the next refresh. We've had a huge response to this webinar with lots of questions from parents, which is really great, and I think should be an encouragement to your work and the important role of parents and their interest in this area. If we don't rattle through them all this afternoon, I would encourage everyone in this call to put in questions and comments in the chat function, and one of my parent kind colleagues is keeping an eye on that and will record all the comments. And I know you've agreed very kindly with your colleagues to write a blog for the Parent Kind website after this webinar. But I've tried to group the questions into some themes as best I can. We've had questions on things like SEND, RSHE, testing, and then the wider role of the curriculum. And I might start by asking you a question on testing itself. And one parent has written in to ask, will you move away from memory tests?
Oh, that's a really good question. And actually, I've been having conversations about this just this morning. So I think that you know, there's quite a strong consensus in the evidence that we've heard that the focus on recall in tests and exams is something that people are concerned about. Questions about, you know, does it actually test knowledge in practice? Is it meaningful, given that, you know, we can all access resources often at the touch of a button, and so, you know, we don't need things stuck in our memory, etc., etc. These kinds of questions. There's also questions linked to that about the relative reliance in our system on kind of sudden death tests, high stakes tests, as they're often known. The counter side, again, I feel that I'm going to be going into a long list of dilemmas in our discussion today, is of course that those methods of kind of national tests have been shown to be the most robust and also the most fair in eradicating teacher bias. And, you know, we're all biased. This is no reflection on teachers, but you could see, you know, it was a great case points through the pandemic when we had teacher assessed grades. You know, you could see immediately how that disadvantaged, socioeconomically disadvantaged pupils, and some from particular ethnic groups, while advantaging affluent students, and notably, you know, those in private schools as well. So definitely in terms of fairness, national tests have an important role to play, but there's been a lot of you know, questions about actually whether they adequately represent, as I think the questioner was asking, the different preferences and capabilities of young people who might prefer to be assessed in a range of different ways. So weighing up those different trade-offs again, alongside being mindful that we don't want to increase teacher workload at a time when things are already very, very stretched, are all things that are informing our discussion at the moment. But definitely the question about whether we ought to have more diversity in our assessment is one that we will be adjudicating.
Thank you. We've also had a question about Year 6 SAT. So I think that's one of the moments as parents, and I speak as the parent of a Year 4 child who will no doubt be taking SATs potentially in a couple of years. Would you consider, are you considering getting rid of SATs at Year 6 when children are 10 or 11? Because for the parent that wrote into us, they say it has sucked all the joy out of primary school in that final year.
Yeah, and I'm so sorry to hear that. That's not what we would be wanting, of course. And I think consideration of how we try to alleviate some of those pressures is really important. I also remember myself as a parent, you know, my own young children coming through their SATs. And of course, they are a sort of, you know, a marker, aren't they, of the end of primary schooling, and can feel very significant. Again, I think that the trade-offs that we're balancing there are about ways to both establish for secondary schools what young people are capable of as they progress into secondary, and indeed diagnosing where there are problems and issues to be where young people need to be supported, and also being able to, frankly, hold primary schools to account for the public money that is invested in primary schooling. You know, we need ways to monitor and measure the input that primary schools are having. So within an evolution, not revolution approach to the review, I think it's very unlikely that we would scrap SATs. But nevertheless, we will definitely be trying to look at how those stresses that we've heard a lot about in our evidence already can be alleviated for the sake of everybody in the system, young people, obviously their parents and their teachers.
Thank you. SEND is an issue that has come up a lot in conversations that we have at Parent Kind, and in advance of this afternoon's webinar. We had a parent who is also, I think, a teacher of special educational needs write in to ask. They would like to know how the changes that the report will recommend will impact on this cohort of children with special educational needs and disabilities.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we'd be really disappointed if there was no impact. You know, this is one of the issues that we want to take really seriously in the review. And again, this is foregrounded in our terms of reference. We recognise that for young people with SEND and their parents and wider families, the system has not been working well, and there's an incredible level of strain and stress for those families as well in the system at present. So we'd really hope that we can make a positive contribution to that situation. Nevertheless, it's also been notable to me to date that when we talk to young people and parents of young people with SEND, many of the issues that they raise are not actually to do with the curriculum. They're primarily to do with resourcing, support, and kind of bespoke understanding, and also elements around sort of pedagogy, but particularly accountability and assessment, which many parents and families feel is kind of either incentivizing schools to behave in ways that aren't supportive of their children, or kind of precluding schools to respond in the ways that parents would like. Nevertheless, there are, of course, issues that are to do with curriculum and perhaps particularly assessment that we can address. One of the issues that we hear about again and again is how sort of compressed the curriculum is at present. You know, many people use the phrase overstuffed. Many teachers talk about having to get through the curriculum content, and that obviously can be both stressful for young people with special educational needs, but also for their teachers not give that time for thoughtful, bespoke responses to young people's needs. So I think that that's an area that we will be looking at closely. Another dilemma, I think, that we're considering in relation both to special educational needs, but this also has a bearing on, to some extent, on young people from socially, economically disadvantaged backgrounds as well, is about the trade-off between catch-up and sort of compensatory teaching on core subjects, numeracy and literacy, notably in primary, maths and English in secondary. You know, these subjects are obviously really important foundations for access to both the future curriculum, but also to kind of life and work. But nevertheless, there is often a feeling and a complaint that young people, especially those with SEND, are being, taken out of mainstream classes to have lots of extra catch-up provision and so forth. And that is limiting their access to a wider, rich curriculum and subjects like modern foreign languages and so on. So again, these issues are not easy to resolve, but I hope that gives you some illustration of the sorts of things that we're considering.
That's really helpful, and SEND was an issue that came up again and again in sort of in advance of this afternoon's session. And I know we know at Parentkind through our research that it's a really big worry for a lot of parents, and particularly those parents who are within the system and sometimes struggling with it. Looking at the very beginnings of school life, I know you said at the very beginning that preschool was outside the remit of your review, but reception isn't. The first few months, days even of a child's formal education from the age of about 4 is really important. And I know the current government is talking a lot about early years and the first few years of education as the building blocks of future learning. One parent wrote in to say that they were shocked to see children turn up to reception class with dummies, unable to speak properly. And there's been a lot of media comment and evidence, I think, in recent years on some of the impacts perhaps of COVID and lockdown on children coming into the school system. How can the review support teachers to close the gap as they see it between those who haven't quite suffered as much and those who are turning up at the age of 4 in reception classes, really struggling and perhaps not quite ready for formal schooling?
It's a great question and a really thought-provoking takeaway, actually. I don't think I have all the answers to this question, but it's one that definitely I and the panel should ruminate on. I suppose that, and to reassure, we're very mindful of the issue of reception, which sort of falls outside the national curriculum as such, but nevertheless is absolutely crucial and sort of almost falls between gaps at the moment. I think that there's an issue about kind of skills and readiness to learn, which again, some of which I think relates to the curriculum, and some of which relates to broader early years or early primary practice, and where we do have actually good evidence of effective interventions as well. This, of course, comes back to my prior role as leader of the Education Endowment Foundation, where we know both about, as has rightly been suggested, the crucial importance of the early years and early learning for closing gaps later in life, but also really good, highly evidenced examples of best practice where early intervention can make a difference. When it comes to issues about sort of though potty training and dummies, I am much less aware of evidence in that scope at all. So that this point about the kind of COVID legacy for the earlier start in life, I think is a really great takeaway for me.
Thank you. One of the big issues that comes through our research when we survey parents is enjoying school. There's a lot of narrative, perhaps in places like the House of Commons and inside government, about attainment, passing exams, showing what you've learned. But for parents, I think enjoying school is also as important, and a lot of our evidence shows that. That theme comes out very strongly in our research, and it might also be a precursor to more serious mental health problems when it starts to go wrong too, which is something we're all very concerned about. So how important do you think it is that enjoying school and children's well-being is placed at the heart of both the school curriculum and then the way we assess learning too? And do you think we should talk about enjoying school just a bit more?
I think it's absolutely crucial. And actually putting a little bit of the joy back into learning, is key to our review, I think. Again, I think that there's a sort of consensus in the views that we've heard that that has suffered over time, and perhaps particularly coming through the pandemic and out to the other side, and given the many social pressures, increasing child poverty, etc., the stresses on young people, both I think within and without school, are profound, and clearly that's also impacting presence in the classroom. So it would be simplistic and probably wrong to say that all of this comes down to the school curriculum. I think the school curriculum is one small element in a much wider complex picture, but nevertheless, clearly it is an element, and there's more that we can do there. I think the focus on choice, which often young people and their families have felt is a bit lacking, is something that we can look at. So here, Frank, I'm thinking about, for example, subject choice in secondary school. And I think, again, that question about concerns that the curriculum has become very overstretched and overstuffed, again, has, according to the teachers that we've talked to and many organisations that have fed into our review as well, is suggested to be meaning that we lack the kind of flex around the national curriculum for teachers to either go into depth and bring the subject to life, or indeed do extra kind of enrichment, bring, a localized curriculum and so on, that really engages young people with their learning. So definitely, I think it's the right question to ask. I really recognize that point about, for children and young people, schooling is such a long time and such an important section of their lives. And we really do want them to be happy and healthy in that time.
I thank you. And this was something that we talked about a lot when Parentkind made a submission earlier this month to your review, because that was the evidence we were getting from parents, and we very consciously talk about school enjoyment or enjoying school, and are not afraid to say that. And it would be nice to hear more of that from people who are in positions of power and influence too.
Well, I think, if I may, Frank, I think it's a really great reflection, and I think it has to be both, doesn't it? I mean, every parent wants their child to do well at school, whatever starting point that, whatever well looks like. They want their children to feel that they're making progress, and have their successes built and celebrated through schooling. And of course, we know how incredibly important attainment is, whether it's of GCSE maths and English, that is a sort of platform to further work and access to many routes and pathways post 16, or whether it's flourishing in a range of different ways for which we need both recognition and credentials. So attainment is incredibly important for life chances, and given we're taking a social justice perspective, that remains crucial. But as you say, if young people actually end up sort of voting with their feet almost, and aren't happy at school, that would be both super disturbing, whether you're a parent or otherwise, but also completely lacking efficacy in what we want to achieve. So I think it's both and, happiness and well-being and attainment.
Absolutely. And I'd like to move on to the role of parents. We're here this afternoon as parents to talk about, our interest in the work that you're doing and the education ultimately that our children receive in school. I'd be interested to know how you think the role of parents will be represented in the work of your review and then the final report that will come from it.
Yeah, thanks for that. Well, I think you've mentioned a couple of the means already. Obviously, there was the call for evidence where both organisations like your own that represent parents have submitted, but also individual parents and groups of parents have submitted as well. We've also, as I've said, been travelling across the country and having parental input at our engagement events, as well as obviously, webinars like this one. So those views that have been gathered will then, as with the other evidence, be presented back to the panel and distilled, and then will be represented in our reports going forward. But parents are an incredibly important stakeholder group. They're something of a lightning rod, I would say, because, well, on many different levels, they're politically important, of course, and have enormous power in that regard. But they're also those who are closest to their offspring, who often may not be able to articulate their feelings or have those platforms of influence, and parents can represent them. So that's a super important point. The final point to say is that we've also done polling with parents and young people, actually. But we've done various polls, including one when with parents of young people who had just taken their GCSEs and post-16 qualifications. So right at that critical point when exam results had just been received. So yeah, all of these different data points and means of evidence will be feeding into our distillation.
That's really encouraging. And ParentKind does a lot of polling of parent voice too, which we have submitted to your review to make sure that parents are heard, collectively are heard loud and clear. And one of the things we often say is parents just don't think one thing very often, lots of different views, but sometimes there are themes that emerge from the polling that we and you and others conduct. Would you, and I'm really reassured by that answer, and sometimes I think parents can feel as though they're a bit forgotten within the politics of education almost, and that's something that does come out very strongly in our research. And would your review anticipate making some sort of statement about the importance of parents to the curriculum and education and outcomes and so on?
Well, thanks for that, Frank. That's certainly a takeaway for me. I'm sort of, you can probably see the cogs whirring, thinking, well, what's our report going to look like? What's the structure going to be? But if there is a means and it's appropriate, in our presentation to do that, we will, because it's true. And everything that you've said about the importance of parents as a stakeholder group is absolutely right. Parents have such a strong role to play in their kids' education, and I'd really encourage participants on this call. Many of them will already be involved in the school in various ways, and including as governors, I'm sure. But those roles are super important. So it would be disappointing to me to feel that parents feel not heard, because they are crucial in the community around the school and in supporting their schools.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to, we've got about 10 minutes left. You've done an amazing amount of work this afternoon to try and answer all the questions that have come through. I do want to ask a question about RSHE, relationships and sexual health education, often in the media, often in the news. And I understand that your review will look at RSHE. And I would like to ask how you anticipate managing the concerns of parents around the teaching of potentially contentious parts of RSHE, both in lessons and perhaps in the wider school environment too, within your new curriculum and curriculum recommendations?
Thanks, Frank. Well, this is a sort of slightly complicated one for our review, actually, in terms of sort of timing. And if you imagine that there's a lot of work that's been going on at the department already over time, and this is one example. So the curriculum and assessment review is looking at the whole of the curriculum and how it fits together to ensure that there's space for schools to provide a broad experience. And we'll consider RSHE in that context. But RHSE is statutory guidance that sets out the topics that pupils should be taught. And that was subject to a separate review and consultation, as I think you're nodding, you're aware of this.
We submitted evidence from parents.
Very good. So the Secretary of State's been really clear that the department will look carefully at those consultation responses and discuss them with stakeholders, I believe, and consider the relevant evidence, including the CAS review, which has since been published, before setting out their next steps. So that will be done by the department rather than by my review. So that's taking place alongside the curriculum and assessment review. And I guess in a way, it's one of, as I said, there's a range of these different things that have either been precipitated before our review or that are kind of ongoing work alongside us. Our efforts are to try to ensure that things remain reasonably joined up. Of course, we can't expect the department to sort of stop its work for a year, so it's right that those carry on. But what we don't want to do is kind of misalign messages along the way. So that's something that we're trying to be attuned to.
Thank you very much. You hinted at sort of concerns that have come through so far about the curriculum being overstuffed. We've had several questions from parents asking, is the national curriculum too prescriptive and ambitious, given the number of hours in the school day?
Well, I think that question is exactly the question that we're asking. We've heard this opinion so many times, both in the formal evidence we're receiving and across the country in all our events, both from teachers, from wider audiences at our engagement events, etc., etc. I guess the harder question, Frank, so basically there seems to be this almost unanimous consensus that the curriculum is currently overloaded as it's experienced on the ground. The question is why that is in some cases. So obviously there's what's stipulated in the national curriculum, and sometimes you could see that as very heavily prescribed, but in others, very much not so much. If anything, it's rather under-prescribed. So then there's a question of like why we're seeing then this sort of overload as it's experienced on the ground. And that could be for a whole range of different reasons. It could be schools kind of imagining what they think Ofsted would like to see. It could be about kind of local practices on the ground, kind of building over time as teachers add more things in and don't take things away. It could be due to the stipulations of, say, the Multi-Academy Trust and their expectations about curriculum, and so on and so forth, or indeed due to the qualifications, exam boards, work, and so forth. So trying to disaggregate those different things, I think, is going to be a sort of crucial next stage as the curriculum review works forward.
Thank you very much. You have a lot of work ahead of you to answer some of these really thorny questions. Will there be less of a focus on targets and content in core subjects, allowing time to consolidate and assessment to support all children?
Well, I think that that's exactly what the implication of my last set of comments were. If we can establish places where the curriculum is currently overprescribed or overloaded, being able to comb out that excess content would allow teachers to be able to teach with greater depth and really engage and ensure that foundation concepts are properly understood and mastered, which so often doesn't happen at present. So introducing that extra rigor into teaching and learning, but also would allow that crucial flexibility for, as I've said, extra depth of engagement, the practical work that brings the curriculum to life, and flexibility around both local demographic needs or the needs of individual young people in the classroom.
We've got time for just a couple more questions. And I wanted to ask about two topics that are quite current, really. Oracy is something that has come up quite a bit in recent years as a new area, perhaps of the education system. And I wondered what your thoughts are on the role for oracy in a revised, refreshed curriculum.
Yes, so the benefits of oracy and being able to speak and communicate effectively, take turns with other children, and communicate in those team ways as well as individually. All of these skills are shown to be very important, and the benefits of good oracy practice and competence is well evidenced. Again, keeping up with my theme of explaining some of the dilemmas that we're negotiating through the process of the review, how we formalize that in the curriculum is probably more challenging than recognize the benefits, because actually in the existing curriculum, oracy was given a strong place in the last curriculum review, but because it's often not tested and formally assessed, it's felt that often it's not something that is foregrounded, whereas often what is examined tends to dominate. So then there's a question for us really as a review panel: do we want to add to assessment by introducing, assessment of oracy, or do we actually want to prioritize, working against a further building of assessment and testing and so forth? And again, this is a genuine dilemma. So I think that oracy is something that we're going to be taking seriously, but the sort of what that will look like in terms of our recommendations, I wouldn't yet like to comment on.
We wouldn't expect you to either, but I am very conscious of time, and I probably have time for one last question. And I'm equally conscious that in the coming years, AI might replace research directors, as it might replace many other roles, but there will be opportunities too, I'm sure, with the AI revolution. And I wonder if you might say something about how schools can prepare our future workforce for the AI world that is emerging.
Yeah, thanks for that, Frank. The interesting and sort of slightly frustrating thing with the world of AI, including generative AI at the moment, is that it feels as though we're on the cusp of something which in perhaps 5 years' time might have revealed its direction and its major benefits in this space, but at present is currently underdeveloped, and also under tested and proven. There's a lot of reference, for example, to adaptive assessment, where AI would be able to respond to a child as they go through answering questions online, targeting further questions based on the level of attainment or level of understanding demonstrated by the child to that end, and so forth, which all sounds exciting and super promising, but you can already see some of the potential problems with that in terms of, were an algorithm to cap attainment based on, a child might be very good at one tiny strand, but bad at other, that diversity. And we already see some of the kind of stereotyping and misassumptions that come through in algorithmic responses. So in terms of impacts in those assessment outcomes, I feel that we're really still in the foothills. And also, of course, Frank, there's the massive challenge still, particularly for primary schools and small primaries, of access to good IT infrastructure at all. So although I don't want to rule anything out, and of course, it would be negligent not to engage with digital promise and indeed the promise of AI as part of our review, my imagination is that within a year, it's very unlikely that we'll be sort of changing systems around this, because I think that things just aren't at that level yet. Perhaps in the next review, everything will have changed.
And I think that is perhaps something that we will dwell on as we bring this webinar to an end, that everything does change. And but you have managed expectations very effectively. But this nevertheless is, I think, an important moment for our education system and as parents, the schools that our children go to and the education they receive in the classroom. And I really, in closing this afternoon's webinar, want to thank you for spending so much time with us this afternoon. Thank you for agreeing to talk to parents and talk about the role of parents in your review and what that might look like. I hope we have given you some cause for thought and to ponder on how parents could be further included in the work that your panel is doing. And I want to thank, finally, all the attendees this afternoon, everyone who has dialed in to listen to your very thoughtful and substantial answers, and we're grateful for that. And I hope for everybody listening, this is not the last Parent Kind webinar that you are able to join. We hope to hold many more in 2025, and I look forward to seeing you all at the next one. So thank you very much indeed, and have a good afternoon.
Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks to everyone for listening. Bye.